Welcome, everyone. It is an honor to introduce our guest today, Ken Roth. Ken is a graduate of Brown with a degree in history. According to Brown Alumni Magazine, already in those days on College Hill in the 1970s, he participated in the 1975 takeover of the University Hall and protest of proposed financial aid cuts. He was volunteering with an advocacy organization working with people incarcerated at Rhode Island Adult Correctional Institute. And then after Brown, he went on to Yale Law School and then worked as federal prosecutor in New York and in DC. Ken joined Human Rights Watch as deputy director in 1987 and then became its executive director in 1993, the position he held until 2022. He is currently visiting professor at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Ken has received a number of honorary degrees and awards, and also, which is perhaps just as an important recognition of his work defending human rights, he was named persona non grata by the governments of China and Russia, was banned entry to Egypt and Hong Kong, and angered a lot of officials from many other countries, I suppose. So we are here today to discuss Ken's new book, Righting Wrongs. You can get the book out there directly from Brown Bookstore, and after the conversation and the Q&A, Ken will be signing books. So welcome, Ken. As I read your book and listened to parts of it during my commute to Providence, I kept this running list of questions I want to ask you. But many of them now seem kind of heavy and difficult to just jump right in. And I think it's not really my fault because the book is about abusive behavior of the governments, about human rights violations, about war crimes, starvation, mass murder, torture, forced labor, and other crimes against humanity. And to some extent, the limits of justice and the continuing impunity that powerful perpetrators of violence can count on. But it is also about tactics of how we can chip away at this impunity one step at a time. You write that in your fundraising efforts for Human Rights Watch, and this is also true for your book, you tried not to focus so much on atrocities, trying to shock people into action and into supporting Human Rights Watch, but you focused on solutions because there are solutions, and they are partial and temporary and contingent on the whims of leaders. But even those imperfect ways of ending or even pausing an ongoing war crime mean a difference between life and death for some people, and therefore they are worth it. So first of all, a note to students, this book is about why and how good research matters. By researchers who conduct investigations on site in the language, in local language, who are meticulous about getting the details right, who scrutinize the behavior of both sides. To fight human rights abuses, you need facts. Facts are powerful, and according to Ken, they can be more powerful than the law when it comes to persuading people why certain behavior of abusive governments is wrong. So my question, over the first question, over the years, you have worked with, directly or indirectly, with some of the most brutal political leaders or their emissaries whose human rights credentials are very dubious. So to stop Syria's dictator Bashar al-Assad from continuing bombing of civilians in Idlib, you turned for help to Putin via Germany's Chancellor Merkel and the French government. You met with Saif Gaddafi, the son of Libya's dictator Muammar Gaddafi, when he sponsored the investigative visit of the Human Rights Watch to Libya, and with Paul Kagame, who later backed M23 rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So did you, as the director of Human Rights Watch, have a line that you would not cross because of moral or political reasons? Or Or is there no such thing as a Faustian bargain when it comes to human rights work? In other words, was there or is there a person you refuse to negotiate with, engage with?
Okay. Well, first, let me just thank you for hosting me today and for organizing this. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be back at Brown. I mean, as Ieva says, I have a long history here as an undergraduate. I'm about to be term limited out as a member of the board of advisors for the Watson Institute Turning School. And so it's with chagrin that I'm leaving, but I feel that this is kind of my swan song, and I'm going to be attending my last board meeting next week. And just, before you get the wrong idea, I mean, this book is, even though Eva's right, it's about bad stuff, but it's a positive book. It's about how you can change things, how you can make even the most evil government behave somewhat better. And, I lift this up because when my publisher first gave me a proposed cover, it was like this bleak cover, and it was depressing. And I said, you guys haven't read the book. It's like a positive book. And so then they came back with this. This was their second stab. And I was happy with this because it's like, you look at it and think, oh, this isn't bad, But I mean, your question, I actually didn't view myself as bargaining with these evil people. So it's not like I would go in and say, okay, we'll let you take 100 political prisoners if you just release these others. It wasn't like that. Rather, when I would go in to see a head of state or a senior minister, obviously some people you can sit down with. I mean, some just don't really know. They're surrounded by sycophants or they're blinded by what they think is their good intentions. And in those sorts of situations, by providing solid information, you can have a constructive conversation and move them. And I mean, I describe a meeting with a country you're familiar with in Mexico, the former president, where he just had this line that it was good to have the Mexican military involved in law enforcement, and didn't believe that the military was torturing and killing people. And I literally just sat down with him and started reading case studies that we had produced. And by about the third, he realized, they know what they're talking about. And then it actually became constructive. And he ended up making some changes that we had urged. So that's, a more positive kind of meeting. But if you're dealing with a complete thug, where you're not going to get them, you're not going to change their personality. And so the purpose of the meeting is mainly to make them feel pressure. You want them to start sweating. And you do that because, almost the more despicable the leader, the less likely it is that people will tell them the truth. And I didn't have to worry about telling them the truth. They're not going to arrest me. And so I could walk in there and just make clear that the usual stories that they tell for why what they're doing is justified, or the denials they go through to pretend that they're not committing atrocities, are completely not working, that I totally see through this. I've got an entire report filled with illustrations of what they're doing wrong. And they're going to get beaten up in the media. They're going to get their, international aid cut. I kind of lay it out. And I figure, I don't have to pull my punches with these people. So I'm not bargaining with them. I just want them leaving the meeting really uncomfortable, and realize that there's a price to be paid for continuing as they're going. And that's how, you begin over time to move them. And you got to make sure they're getting beaten up in the media. You got to make sure that other governments are pressuring them. And that's what we did. But the purpose of the meeting is to make it clear to them that their usual evasions are not working.
In 1997, Human Rights Watch shared the Nobel Peace Prize as founding member of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. Mm-hmm. As of the beginning of this year, 165 countries, I think, have joined the Mine Ban Treaty, which is also known as the Ottawa Treaty. The US and Israel and India, Pakistan, China, and Russia are not parties to this treaty. The Russian forces have used anti-personnel landmines in their invasion of Ukraine. And Human Rights Watch documented that Ukrainian forces used these rocket-fired anti-personnel mines to retake territory occupied by Russia. And now Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, so all European countries bordering Russia except for Norway, announced that they will be withdrawing from the treaty. So because of the threats they feel from Russia. So this is a big step backwards, but the rationale these governments are giving is that they need to, this is for their security. So this is just one scenario in which this language of national security, as if it were the magic word, gives governments permission to kind of kick human rights to the side. So many countries use this excuse. The United States uses it when we talk about migrants or asylum seekers or Guantanamo. I'll ask you separately about that. Israel and its treatment with Palestinians, I'll turn to that later too. But for now, what can you say about the importance of the Ottawa process and the work of Human Rights Watch in banning landmines and cluster munitions? And are you worried about what's happening now in Eastern Europe with countries withdrawing from the agreement?
Okay, I mean, that's an important question. Let me just begin by explaining what we did to get the landmines treaty, because it actually is a very kind of instructive example of the power of non-governmental groups. Because traditionally, the only people who were interpreting international humanitarian law, basically the Geneva Conventions, were a bunch of military lawyers working for defense departments. And they pretty much had a monopoly on this. The International Committee of the Red Cross would offer its 2 cents, but privately. And military lawyers, sort of by their nature, interpret the law in a way that is deferential to militaries. They're looking out for their client. And so they may tell them, okay, you can't summarily execute a prisoner. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. But if there's any wiggle room, they would approve the conduct. And Human Rights Watch was actually the first group to begin to apply humanitarian law. In other words, if you looked at the human rights movement traditionally, it would apply, as you would expect, human rights law. But human rights law speaks mainly to governments in times of peace. And there's a separate body of law known as international humanitarian law that speaks to armed conflict. And human rights groups just didn't get into this. And we began really out of necessity during the Central American conflicts in the 1980s for 2 reasons. I mean, one is that human rights law doesn't really provide that much guidance about how you fight a war. I mean, what does the right to life mean when you can shoot the combatants on the other side? You need the more refinement of humanitarian law, which explains, these are the things you have to do to spare civilians as much as possible in the midst of an armed conflict. And the other big difference is that human rights law speaks only to governments. Humanitarian law speaks also to rebel groups. So it allows you to look at both sides in conflict, which is important for reasons of neutrality and credibility. Now, the Landmines Treaty is a good illustration of the importance of having a separate voice from military lawyers. Because one of the basic provisions of humanitarian law is that you cannot use indiscriminate warfare. Meaning you've got to shoot actually at a military target. You can't just, carpet bomb an area because there might be a few soldiers there. And landmines are classic indiscriminate weapons. They have no idea who's going to step on them. Nonetheless, all militaries, every Western military, was subscribing to the ban on indiscriminate warfare and using landmines. And the lawyers were just letting them live with this blatant contradiction. And so what Human Rights Watch and a handful of our colleague organizations did is that we started documenting the indiscriminate effect of landmines in a series of different countries, and ended up using these reports to put together initially a global coalition of non-governmental groups, and then a coalition of about 60 governments, small and medium-sized governments, not the superpowers. But together they had the moral clout to push through this treaty, which is now in place. That's why we share the Nobel Peace Prize. And even though to this day the United States has never signed on, landmines have become so stigmatized that hardly anybody uses them. And the recent cases of use are really only Myanmar plus the 2 sides in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine. So it has had a huge impact in terms of just sparing people from being killed or maimed. Now, Ieva, as you say, a handful of governments bordering on Russia, having watched the importance of landmines in eastern Ukraine, are saying, oh, we may need to use them too in case Russia invades us. Now, this is not a smart move from a humanitarian perspective. I mean, if you look at Syria today, people are going home in Syria after having, fled the Assad regime for over a decade, and their villages are littered with landmines. They're getting killed and maimed, even though the war is over with. That's what happens when you use landmines. And, in Ukraine, I think, the area where the fighting is taking place is so depopulated, there's not an immediate concern of that. But at some point, the war is going to be over. People are going to go back and want to farm their land, and it's going to be strewn with landmines. And the same thing will happen, if you're on the border of Lithuania or Latvia or Finland. These are, you can't say, oh, we'll just mine the border. These are people are going to get killed in the future if they actually do this. I also think they're actually misreading Ukraine. I mean, they're like a year behind, because landmines were actually quite important when it was a classic land war, where troops or tanks would come and try to breach through the other side, and landmines would make that harder. Today, it's a drone war. Drones don't care about landmines. And I think, what's happening in eastern Ukraine is foreshadowing what wars are going to be like from now on. So I think that, at this moment when the various states are saying we're going to resort to landmines for self-defense, for national security, they actually are kind of a few years behind where war is at.
So Human Rights Watch is based in the US, headquartered in New York City. And we all know that US has a long history of double standards when it comes to caring about human rights violations by governments that are our allies, like Saudi Arabia or El Salvador, or governments that are our enemies, like China or Iran. It has also been seen as hypocritical because Washington doesn't sign, or even if it signs, doesn't ratify treaties. So, for example, US government refuses besides the Mine Ban Treaty, the US has not signed the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. It hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Protocol on the Convention Against Torture, and a bunch of others. So I was reading your book at the same time that I was writing a review of Greg Grandin's new book, America, America, about the history of Americas. And he makes this argument. He shows how the United States has, at least in this part of the world, but we can look at the entire globe, how the US has been both invading other countries, whether it's like Haiti, Cuba, Guatemala, but also participating in the construction of this system of international law, because a system of global rules, especially one that US managed, was beneficial to Washington. So specifically, Grandin writes, this wasn't hypocrisy. It was a carburation figuring the most efficient mix of fuel and air, of empire and law, domination and arbitration, of going alone and working together. So I don't know whether you agree with Grandin here, but I wanted to ask you, how has this US stance towards international treaties affected your work at Human Rights Watch? Did leaders of other countries point out the US stance as hypocritical?
Yeah. First, you're right that, the US, their view toward treaties is to try to make sure that they're really not bound by them in any meaningful way. So even when the US ratifies a treaty, it does it in a way so it has no domestic effect. It will, enter what are known as reservations, understandings, and declarations that will actually carve out any portion of the treaty that the lawyers in the State Department think might require the U.S. to do something that it's not already required to do. And then if they make a mistake, their insurance policy is they never allow Americans to sue under the treaty. They never sign on to sort of the optional protocols that would allow suits in international bodies. And they declare the treaty so-called non-self-executing, meaning you can't sue under the treaty in U.S. courts. So these become acts for external consumption. They're not acts with domestic effect. Now, one thing I should state, and this is getting back to your earlier comment, the law is important as a matter of legitimacy. If I walk into meet with a government and they sort of say, well, who are you? I can say, I'm here just to try to hold you to the legal standards that you've signed up for. So at a legitimacy level, it matters. But in terms of putting pressure on governments, it's pretty second tier. What matters, as you noted, Ieva, is the facts. And more specifically, what matters is reflecting those facts off the public sense of right and wrong. And so, a key tool that Human Rights Watch uses is that we will carefully do these field investigations. We will put together as detailed and comprehensive and objective an account as we can of a government's human rights violations, and we will then publicize those. And we're very good at getting publicity. When I left the organization, we were getting 1,000 media mentions a day for our work. And that meant we were able to shine a very intense spotlight on governmental misconduct, which, they hated. And they, this undermined their legitimacy, because in today's world, you need to pretend that you're respecting human rights as a way of saying to your people, we're looking out for you, not just ourselves. And if we show that that's not happening, it does tend to delegitimize them. It stigmatizes them. And so the facts matter in this process more than the law, for reasons you can imagine. If I describe something and you read it and say, that's not so bad, I'm not going to succeed in shaming the government. And if I, cite some treaty provision that you've probably never heard of, that's not going to change your mind. So it's really the facts that speak much more powerfully than the law. And so that's, why I don't, put such an emphasis on who has ratified what treaty, because what really matters is, does the public share the treaty's view that certain governmental conduct is wrong? Now, in terms of, do governments come back to us and say, well, why don't you spend your time in the United States? I mean, of course, it's a pretty cheap argument. And I describe in the book how, sometimes we'll walk in with a pile of reports on the United States and, say, okay, that's that. Now let's talk about you, but it doesn't get them very far. It's a classic, whataboutism. And we make clear that, in fact, our largest country or program was the United States, but we're here to talk about you. And then we get back to the real topic.
Well, let's talk about Guantanamo, the big whataboutism. So the name is now synonymous with extraordinary rendition, with torture, indefinite detainment. Almost 800 men and boys, all of them Muslim, have been imprisoned over time in Guantanamo since 2002. According to the Center for Constitutional Rights, 86% were sold to the U.S. during a time when U.S. military was offering large bounties for capture. 22 or more were children when taken to the detention camp. Many were tortured, subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques. As of this year, 15 detainees remain there. 6 men are not charged with any crime or offense, including 3 who have been cleared for release. 9 men have active cases in the military commission system. Only 2 people still in prison have been convicted. 0 government officials have been held accountable for the wrongful detention and torture at Guantanamo. Last year, a plea deal was almost reached, then blocked. You visited Guantanamo. You also spoke to former detainees, one of whom told you, they captured us for no reason, and they let us go without telling us the reason. No one apologized. And then you write, I felt shame on behalf of my country. Is there anything else you would like to say about Guantanamo?
Well, let me address Guantanamo in the context of also the torture, because the two really go hand in hand. And the George W. Bush administration's torture program was a huge priority of mine. And I describe this in quite a bit of detail in the book. But, for the US government, getting back to your earlier question, a supposed proponent of human rights, to suddenly, in the name of national security, be resorting to systematic torture, this was a big deal. This is something that we really had to address. And I spent a huge amount of my time in, 2003, 2004, 2005, trying to persuade people that torture was not only wrong, but that it was unhelpful. And what was interesting about that is that in the context after the September 11th attacks, people were so scared that there was a real tendency to say, just do whatever it takes to protect me. And so torture was kind of popular, and it wasn't enough to say it's illegal or it's wrong. You had to prove that it was unuseful. And so I ended up making these pragmatic arguments in a whole bunch of kind of TV shows and public events and all. And it ended up spending a lot of my time arguing against Alan Dershowitz, who was just, for various reasons, set up as my foil. And he was presenting the reasonable argument that, of course, people torture, so let's just regulate it. Let's make sure that some judge approves it. And obviously in the process, totally legitimizing it. And so I had to argue, that torture is actually, going to backfire by persuading, the friends and families of the victims to be permanent enemies of the United States, by discouraging communities who are most likely to learn about a potentially imminent terrorist plot not to cooperate, because who wants to turn somebody in to be tortured? So I'd run through these kind of pragmatic arguments. In the end, what really shifted it was there was a young U.S. Army captain by the name of Ian Fishback, who was serving in Iraq, who, seeing torture, reported it up the chain of command and was told to shut up. And so he came to us. And we interviewed him, we interviewed a few of his colleagues, and put out a report about the torture described by U.S. personnel, about what U.S. personnel were doing. And that was incredibly powerful. Suddenly it was not just, the terrorists who were saying this, it was Americans who were saying it. And we took Fishback around Capitol Hill. We worked very closely with Senator John McCain, who himself had been a victim of torture in Vietnam, and got through Congress what was called the Detainees Treatment Act, which completely outlawed the loopholes that Bush was using to justify the torture. And so that was, a big step. And in fact, the torture ended. Now, I describe in the book how then meeting with Obama early in his term, trying to persuade him to prosecute the Bush-era torturers, and he wouldn't do it. He was worried about getting Obamacare through Congress. He had various other plans. He didn't want to antagonize people. So he came forth with his, famous look forward, not back formulation. So, the torture stopped, but nobody was prosecuted for it, which means that to this day, it looks like it's a policy option. It's not something there's a criminal precedent behind its use. So that's kind of the history of torture, much of which took place in Guantanamo. Now, Guantanamo, there was a similar process that went on. I mean, the rationale for Guantanamo was that these people are enemy combatants. Even though in the so-called global war on terrorism, even though there was no global war, there was a global effort, but there wasn't an armed conflict really outside of Afghanistan. But the Bush administration used this conceit to say, well, these are combatants, and in a war, you can detain a combatant forever, until the war is over, which this war would never be over. Now, we were able to discredit that argument partly by just pointing to what it means if this is really an enemy combatant. That means if you see a combatant walking down the street in Providence, you can shoot them. You don't have to detain them. In the rules of war, there's no duty to capture a combatant. You can just shoot them. And so playing through kind of some of the consequences of this view, the view that, okay, if you can go to war against Al-Qaeda, can you go to war against the cartels, which is now, of course, something that Trump is proposing. But the real, I think, shame about this approach is that the Republicans, particularly Cheney, thought that they were being tough by using these military commissions in Guantanamo rather than providing regular trials. And the real purpose, there's two purposes. One was to hide the torture. The commissions were designed to make it hard for the suspects to bring forth the torture to which they've been subjected. But second, it was to just be tough. Military commissions sounded tougher than a regular federal trial. But the ironic consequence is that the military commissions were just made up. They have not produced a single trial. They've been challenged left and right. And so I was at the arraignment of the 9/11 suspects in Guantanamo. And I was, I describe in the book, I'm sitting there with some of the families of the 9/11 victims. And at that point, I felt a certain tension between them because I was trying to get a fair trial and they just wanted to see these people convicted. But in fact, our views were completely aligned over the longer term because the absence of a fair proceeding, the refusal by any administration to move these people to regular court in the United States, and the insistence on using these substandard, made up on the fly military commissions is that no trials happen. And, finally, the 9/11 suspects may be pleading guilty, but, in a process that nobody thinks is fair. And this all goes back to kind of the original sin of not trusting the regular courts. They said, oh, it's too dangerous to try them in New York. I worked in that same courthouse where they would have been tried for 4.5 years, 5.5 years, actually. And it would, they've tried everything under the sun, big mafia cases, cartel leaders, terrorist suspects. They could totally handle it. It was ideology. It was not safety that stood behind this. And as a result, the victims of 9/11 have never had justice to this day.
Well, of course, now Guantanamo is also has a new group of detainees. That is, people, migrants caught up in the process of deportation from the United States. There were, I think, over almost 400 people were sent there earlier this year, and some still remain. The U.S. is also sending migrants to the prison in El Salvador, the Secot, and even within the U.S., the government is rapidly moving detained migrants to remote jurisdictions. So from New York or from Massachusetts to Louisiana, which is where both Rumeysa Öztürk and Mahmoud Khalil are, away from families and attorneys. So on the one hand, these detentions of migrants in the U.S., some of whom are U.S. permanent residents, they seem very different from the detention of foreigners who are suspected of terrorism and who are then flown to Guantanamo. But there are also important similarities: arbitrary detention, denial of due process, and gaming with jurisdiction. What do you think?
Well, first, I think it's, this immigration use of Guantanamo. I think we have to remember, and some of the people in the room are, I think, old enough to remember this. This did not begin with Donald Trump. It actually began with Bill Clinton. Okay, Bill Clinton was the first person to start detaining migrants from Haiti in Guantanamo. So there's a long history of this. And the idea is it's offshore. You don't get the rights of having appeared in the United States. And so there is a kind of a lawless goal to it. But with Trump, I mean, this brings up the broader question of, how do you address Trump when he, Trump doesn't read, but the people around him read, and they all are clearly reading from the Autocrat's Handbook, which outlines, it's not a real book, it's a metaphoric book, but metaphorically, it outlines what autocrats do to secure their power, which is essentially chipping away at the checks and balances on executive power. And this is, precisely what Trump is doing in his virtually every action, all these executive orders. So, he's going after the judges by threatening them with impeachment. He's going after the lawyers by retaliating against them if they bring a lawsuit that he doesn't like. He's going after journalists with defamation suits, or by, challenging the parent company that owns the media outlet. He's going after the universities because these are centers of independent thought. He's about to go after civil society by threatening their tax-exempt status. He's essentially silenced the Congress by making the Republican Party all worry about a primary challenge if they were to depart from him. And so this is a very deliberate process. And I think the response to it, there's several key steps to it. One is to make clear that, these are not steps in isolation. So if he's coming after the universities, it's not just, they're a bunch of elite Ivy League universities, who really cares? This is, part of the broader effort to undermine the checks on executive authority. And we need to put it all in that context. Second, the proper response is a concerted response. And I'm very happy to see, among universities that there's this new effort, I guess, led by a couple of professors at Rutgers to build a collective response. And that's what's required. We're seeing this, with some of them. Oh yeah, Trump didn't like that. We're seeing it with some of the, law firms. The first ones cut deals, but now there's a much concerted effort to challenge them. I think there've been something like 150 lawsuits so far against Trump. And this is exactly what we need. You've got to resist every step of the way, and earlier resistance is more effective than later resistance. And I think it's, not only is it slowing him down, which is important because, presidencies lose their momentum over time. Trump very deliberately had this flood the zone strategy. He wanted to just, stun us into acquiescence. And that already is not working anymore. But it also, it's undermining his popularity. What he's doing with immigrants, the public is outraged that he can send anybody to El Salvador and then claim a lack of power to bring them back. He could do that to any of us. It doesn't have to be a non-U.S. citizen. So this, this willingness to penalize people like the Tufts student. She co-authors an op-ed in the Tufts newspaper. That's supposed to be a threat to American national security and foreign policy, and therefore, her First Amendment rights can be discarded. I mean, this is crazy stuff, but it needs to be challenged each step of the way. The public, is souring on Trump because of this. And, while he's never going to lose his MAGA base, so let's say there's going to be, 35% that's always with him, he's losing virtually everybody else. I mean, a poll I just saw showed that 92% of independents are very troubled by what he's doing now. And even Trump cannot be utterly insensitive to public opinion. Certainly the Republican Party, knowing they face midterm elections in a year and a half, is going to be paying attention. So I think, that's the answer here. And we have to use immigration in this broader context to push back as best we can.
Thank you. So I thought I wanted to ask you much more about kind of the United States, because also last week the Human Rights Watch publishes the report about the 100 days of Trump. But in your book, you also, I think you go much deeper, kind of diagnosing a problem in the United States and some other countries where we have this idea that some people, once they have their rights, they want to hoard their rights, but there is an understanding that they can be denied to others. And you talk about repairing social fabric, but maybe this is something that the audience will want to ask about as well. And I will want to open the floor for questions. But before we do that, we have to talk about Israel. Okay. Why? So there's two tools, this book is very much about how you can use pressure and you can use shaming on governments. Why have these tools not worked to stop the mass killing of civilians in Gaza? Even before the war in Gaza, why has pressuring the Israeli government been so unsuccessful? In your book, you discuss the report that Human Rights Watch published in 2021 titled "A Threshold Crossed: Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution." And you write the Israeli government could not find any factual or legal errors in the report, but this didn't stop the policies or practices that the report called out. So why does pressure and shaming have no effect on the Israeli government?
All right. Well, let me sort of qualify your question a little bit and then answer it, because I actually disagree that it has no effect. In other words, let me take the apartheid report that you described. So this is a report, I guess it was about 4 years ago, that Human Rights Watch issued a very detailed report. Not an analogy to South Africa, but rather a legal analysis under the Convention Against Apartheid and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And in 200 plus pages of detail, we outlined why Israel is committing the oppressive discrimination that adds up to apartheid in the occupied territories. And it was such a solid report that, the Israeli government didn't know what to do with it. And its supporters, resorted to the usual, name calling, we're anti-Semitic, we're biased, whatever. I took as a victory because they just couldn't address it substantively. And the effect of that, I think, was significant in that today, and it wasn't just Human Rights Watch, because B'Tselem came out with a similar report and Amnesty a little bit later. So there is now a consensus among every serious human rights group that's looked at the issue that this is apartheid. And this past summer, the International Court of Justice also affirmed that it's apartheid. The significance of this is in terms of the political options that are on the table. And there are basically 4 options for the Israeli-Palestinian problem. One, which is, the one that Trump has been putting forward now, which is, solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. That's going nowhere. That would be a massive war crime, a crime against humanity. Even Egypt and Jordan, despite their, millions and millions of dollars of U.S. military assistance, have said, no way, we're not going along with this. So that's a dead letter. It's the dream of the Israeli far right. It's not going to happen. Although I do think that's the way to understand Israel's genocidal conduct. They're trying to make life so miserable in Gaza that people then voluntarily leave. That's what's going on. A second option has been to recognize that the settlement project is so advanced that a Palestinian state is hopeless. And the people who have that view describe what's called a one-state reality. There is just one state now. We should forget about 2 states. But within that one state, there should be equal rights. But of course, the Israeli government will never countenance that because they're roughly the same number of Jews and Arabs in that territory, and they would lose their Jewish majority. So that's going nowhere. The third option, and this is the significance of apartheid, is endless occupation. That's Netanyahu's, preference if he can't get the far right expulsions. Status quo. But now the status quo is understood as not just, the unfortunate situation until the peace process is concluded, because there is no peace process. The status quo is understood as apartheid, as not acceptable. And so, leaving aside the United States, that really is no longer viewed as a viable option. Which then brings us back to the least bad option, which is the two-state solution. Israel and Palestine living in peace side by side. And, the Israeli government doesn't want that. But that is, I think, the only long-term solution to this. And this is ironically where, maybe we can get Trump to do the right thing for the wrong reason, because the fact that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize, which is, laughable at a certain level, but good. I like the fact that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize because this gives us something to work with. And he's not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for mass expulsion of Palestinians. He will get a Nobel Peace Prize for actually getting peace and, his grand Middle East deal that he hopes for, Saudi normalization of relations with Israel, the Saudi crown prince says, not without a Palestinian state. And Trump is in an ironic position to make that happen. Because, you ask, why is it so hard to move Israel? Well, because Israel really, especially Netanyahu, plays to an audience of one, which is currently Trump, but it's basically whoever's the leader of the Republican Party, not even the president if it's a Democrat. Because, the Israeli base in the United States today is not American Jews, since most American Jews vote Democratic. There's AIPAC, but AIPAC is, a relatively small conservative element of American Jewry. It's mainly Christian evangelicals. Those are the big supporters of Israel via the Republican Party. And Donald Trump owns the Republican Party. So while Netanyahu could just ignore Biden, he can't ignore Trump. That's why Trump was able to get Netanyahu to agree to the temporary ceasefire at the end of January. That's why Trump was able to say no when Netanyahu wanted to bomb Iran. Trump also can say, you got to take this two-state option. And, it's the last thing Netanyahu wants, but Trump is the one person who can make that happen if we can persuade Trump that the thing he cares about most, which is himself, can't be served unless he, twists Netanyahu's arm. And so I think that that's the strategy of the state. I mean, I don't think it's likely, but I think it's the best shot we have at getting beyond this, horrible situation of genocide in Gaza and apartheid in the West Bank.
I was gonna bring up your Guardian article because when I saw the headline that Trump wants the Peace Prize, here's how he can get one, I was like,
what happened?
Oh no, like I am shocked, which is the intended effect, but also I know exactly what you're gonna argue in that piece. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I don't know, do we need to use a microphone?
Probably
do we
not.
have a microphone?
I think we're okay.
No. Okay, fine, no microphone. Mustafa.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I think I want to carry on with the conversation on Palestine and Israel. I'm thinking, as students, we have seen how the exception to Palestine has all been one thing, whether in academic circles and larger civil society circles, and how the genocidal war over the past 2 years has brought it up back to the top of the human rights agenda in some ways or another, and maybe has, your work for advocating for Palestinian rights and the reality has been very instrumental in the international human rights circle. And I was wondering how that has been over the past 2 years, and so if that takes a lot of pushing and pulling, and how that reception within showcasing those war crimes has been in your field.
Well, I mean, I describe in the book how Israel stood out among, the 100 countries we worked on, in that it had the most organized group of supporters, so that we knew that whatever we put out that was critical of Israel, we would be lambasted. And you just live with that. I mean, that's the case. Because of that, I personally reviewed everything we put out on Israel and Palestine, because I knew I would have to defend it. And I didn't want to have to say, I would have written that differently. I just wanted to be able to stand by it 100%. So I reviewed it all. And they would come after us. I mean, They went after our funders. It turned out not to matter because most people who support Human Rights Watch believe in the principles. And, every once in a while we'd lose a donor, but that's just the price of doing the right thing. These days, the favored accusation is anti-Semitism, which I think, and I've been saying this, is harming Jews because anti-Semitism is a real problem, and it's clearly risen in the last 2 years. But if the charge of anti-Semitism is seen as an excuse to stymie criticism of Israel, it cheapens the concept at a point where it's needed. It basically says that, we're going to prioritize defending the war crimes of Netanyahu over the welfare of Jews around the world. That's what's going on. And Trump is only making it worse by citing anti-Semitism as his excuse to stifle criticism of Israel on campuses and kind of force universities to be, to move ideologically to the right. So this does enormous harm. And I've been saying this. I realize it's kind of easier for me to say it because I'm Jewish, because I've had such a long history of defending human rights, in all parts of the world that, let them call me anti-Semitic. It really makes no difference, But I think that it's important, as for those who feel comfortable, to challenge us. We shouldn't, fall back and say, oh no, I don't want to be charged with anti-Semitism. They're the ones who are misusing the term. They're the ones who are cheapening it and endangering Jews. And we should be very clear about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, this is going to be a bit long. Hi, my name is Teddy and I'm a senior. First, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Also, while this question may seem critical of Human Rights Watch and some of your comments, I want to be clear that I deeply respect the work that both you and Human Rights Watch have done to uphold human rights and protect vulnerable populations around the world. I'm especially grateful for the core takeaway from your opinion piece that I'll reference shortly, namely the call to make sense of conflict by looking at the unfolding situation through the lens of international humanitarian law. Brown often prides itself on its activist history, and I've noticed that this ethos can sometimes blur the line between advocacy and analytical inquiry. For example, I once heard a professor in the Middle Eastern Studies department say that her classes are 60% academic and 40% activist, which suggests a framework where activism may at times diverge from what we typically think of as critical or technical analysis. Earlier today, you mentioned the competing interests between military attorneys and nonprofit human rights groups. Similar to this idea of activism deviating from academic rigor, you mentioned Human Rights Watch cares more about the facts and not the law, aiming to, in a sense, rally support for the public to pressure their respective governments. Human Rights Watch states in its mission that it aims to protect the most at risk, including vulnerable minorities and civilians in wartime. This mission often involves interpreting violations of the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law in a way that foregrounds the protection of civilians. At times, this leads Human Rights Watch to adopt legal interpretations that are contested within the field of international law. For instance, following the June 8, 2024 Israeli hostage rescue, you tweeted, "The Israeli hostage raid seemed to in part to use a soldier dressed as a civilian. That is the war crime of perfidy when it results in death or injury because it endangers civilians. That's why soldiers wear uniforms in combat." However, legal scholars such as Todd Huntley at Georgetown Law argue that in hostage rescue scenarios, where the primary intent is not to harm the adversary but to recover captives, the use of civilian clothing may not violate international humanitarian law, and in fact might align with this purpose of minimizing harm to civilians. Similarly, in October 2023, Human Rights Watch condemned Israel's alleged use of white phosphorus in Gaza, stating that it violates the international humanitarian law prohibition on putting civilians at unnecessary risk. Yet, experts at the Stockton Center for International Law have argued that the legality of such use depends on specific facts and must be assessed under the law of armed conflicts conduct of hostilities rules. A third example is Human Rights Watch assertion in the early stages of the war that Gaza is legally occupied, subjecting Israel to provisions of occupation law. In December 2023, however, international legal scholar Michael Schmidt observed that this view is itself subject to genuine legal disagreement, as reasonable minds differ. In each of these cases, it seems that Human Rights Watch is motivated by a commendable desire to protect civilians and prevent further suffering. However, it appears that at times, its legal interpretations reflect more restrictive readings of international law than those endorsed by some leading experts in the field. This pattern may come with consequence for how such statements are received. To give one final example, in your Princetonian opinion piece titled "The Law Limits Israel's Response to Hamas," you wrote that Israel's military's landing of certain Gaza neighborhoods appears to violate this rule, referencing the prohibition against indiscriminate attacks. Yet when a similar point was raised on Brown's campus last year by a professor teaching ethics and international affairs, Benjamin Wittes offered a cautionary response. He emphasized the need to reserve judgment until we understand what the military actors knew at the time, and whether their actions, though tragic, were based on mistakes or miscalculations rather than violations of law. In Lawfare, he wrote, "If it is not a crime to kill civilians. It is a war crime to target civilians or to target enemy forces with insufficient attention to the requirements of necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity."
Can you please ask a question?
Okay, sorry. So my question is, do you think, even when acting in good faith to protect civilians, the use of contested interpretations of international law might complicate Human Rights Watch's ability to persuade or influence state actors in moments where the legal consensus is more firmly on your side? Does this emphasis on activism undermine its credibility in spaces that value complexity, nuance, and legitimacy of international law?
Okay. That's a good question. Let me, as I was alluding to earlier with the discussion of indiscriminate warfare, Human Rights Watch very self-consciously does press for a pro-civilian interpretation of humanitarian law. We're limited in that we can't be pie in the sky. We can't just say anything, because we're ultimately trying to persuade the military lawyers. And so we do have to operate within kind of a narrow sphere of feasibility, and which we try to do. You cite, various experts. I'm an expert too. I've been doing this for, 35 years. I can kind of hold my own against any of these people. So and sometimes you get a battle of experts, but in the end, who wins is the people who put forth the most persuasive argument. And so, rather than getting in all the details here, which is probably too much for this conversation, I would recommend that everybody look to a piece that I had in the New York Review of Books last summer called "The Wars of Crime in Gaza," where I go through in quite a bit of detail why this has been indiscriminate warfare in Gaza, why many of the attacks have had disproportionate harm to civilians, why the Israeli government has actually been disregarding the presumption of civilian status in their use of lethal force. And I just give a lot of concrete examples, within the confines of a 4,000-word article or whatever. I've also, published a series of things in The Guardian. So for example, the hostage rescue thing, look at my Guardian piece. It's all spelled out there. But I don't think that we're just twisting the law. I think we're putting forth completely reasonable, plausible, pro-civilian interpretations of the law. I don't pretend that's the only possible interpretation. You always get pro-military lawyers who can argue the other way. This is why I think it's good that we're operating in the realm of public opinion and not just behind the closed doors of, kind of military lawyers conference, because militaries actually have to behave better now than they used to before groups like Human Rights Watch entered the picture.
Go ahead.
I'm old enough to remember a famous picture from the Vietnam War. You probably remember, it's maybe in your book, the little girl, badly burned, terrified. That actually changed the attitude about Vietnam greatly, that one picture. Now I watch and see the same sort of horror in Gaza, and I'm not seeing the response.
Well, there has been broad global response. If you kind of take a poll around the world, there's outrage at what Israel's doing in Gaza. But as I said earlier, Netanyahu at this point is concerned about one person, and that's Donald Trump. And, Trump so far is not moved by the plight of the Palestinians. He sees this as a real estate opportunity, build the Riviera in Gaza. So, what does it take to move Trump? It's, to some extent it'll be polling, but I think we have to play to his aspirations, and he, for the moment is giving Netanyahu a green light. If I were Netanyahu, I wouldn't bank on that green light lasting forever. Trump is not a principled defender of Israel. He's not a principled defender of anything other than himself, And so I think Trump is movable if he sees it as in his self-interest. And that's the task before us. I'm not pretending it's easy, but I do think we need to continue to spotlight the plight of Palestinian civilians who are being bombed and starved in Gaza. And, public opinion is turning, but Trump's opinion hasn't turned yet. And that's where we have to focus.
Yeah.
So a couple weeks ago, we hosted a conference in this room about media, press freedom, and democracy in Africa. and there were several African investigative journalists who said that, for years, decades, when they would face threats from their dictatorial governments, they would go and report to the U.S. Embassy. And just the existence of the U.S. Embassy sort of served as a symbol of a powerful entity that cared about press freedom and that they could sometimes rely on, sometimes not, but served as an important symbol to them. And I guess my question is, now, and they said in this conference that now they don't feel that they can go to the U.S. Embassy. They don't know what they'll meet. They don't think it stands for the same things it stood for. So I guess my question is, how important, how bad is it, what's happening in the United States now for the work of organizations like Human Rights Watch and for human rights in general around the world?
Yeah. Look, I mean, traditionally, the U.S. government has been an inconsistent but nonetheless very important defender of human rights. And there are many examples like the one you cited that could be mentioned. What I can note, though, is that this is not the first time we've had a hostile administration in Washington. We had the first Trump administration. We had the George W. Bush administration. We had Bill Clinton's opposition to the International Criminal Court. I mean, so we've gone through this. And the key to survival has been building coalitions of other governments that are willing to sort of enter the fray and pick up the human rights mantle that Washington has dropped. And so if you look at the last Trump administration, for example, we got Maduro condemned and monitored by the UN Human Rights Council, actually because it was not led by Trump. If Trump had led it, it would have been dismissed as Yankee imperialism. But it was led by a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada. It was seen as principled, and we won. We did something similar with the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of Yemeni civilians. We got Netherlands to lead there. I described this in the book. It was a big campaign, a big fight. The U.S. was irrelevant to that. We got other governments to take the lead. And there are many examples of that. I think, the International Criminal Court is instructive because this wasn't a Republican administration, it was a Democratic administration. And the U.S. was determined at that stage to prevent the court from ever prosecuting an American. We said, no, that's not justice, and put together, similar to the landmines campaign, a coalition of about 60 governments, small and medium size, that together had the moral and the political clout to stand up to Washington. And in the final vote at Rome in 1998, we won 120-7. So this is doable. And we need to do the same thing now. What makes this a little bit more difficult, not that Trump is, he's a little bit worse than last time, but it's the same thing. I mean, Trump wasn't there for us last time either. This time, though, because of Trump's chaotic approach, the natural allies of the human rights movement are all focused foremost on protecting themselves. And they don't have as much bandwidth to step in and play a positive human rights role. That's what we need to do. In fact, I just finished writing a piece, kind of a clarion call to them to kind of play the role this time that they played last time. But that's what we need to do. It's early days. We don't know how it's going to come out yet, but we do have precedents of being able to sort of circumvent Washington's opposition to the defense of human rights and still get a whole lot done. And that's what we have to do now.
So we have time for one more question. I know there was one in the back.
Thank you so much.
Oh, if we can make it to the
Well, you both ask the questions, but make it short and then
Okay.
we'll see how.
I like pragmatism too. How much attempt has been done to reach out to J Street and to use General Petraeus' argument for a military alternative to the Gaza situation?
What was the last part of the question? Military alternative to what?
General Petraeus had basically proposed that Israel try the Iraqi surge in the Gaza Strip, which isn't nice, I admit, but it's better than the mass slaughter now.
And the other question, okay.
Yeah.
And also J Street.
Yeah.
After what attempts have there been to make some coalition building with J Street?
Okay, well, just answer this
And
question.
the other question.
Okay.
Social media. I love you talking about facts. Facts seem to be deep sixed with social media, and I just wonder how that changes your work as an organization that's really focused on long-form journalism.
Thank you.
I mean, J Street, the simple answer is yes, of course, we reach out to them. With the apartheid report, we actively reached out to them. They didn't feel that they could use the term themselves, but they were very supportive of the effort. In terms of, what to do with Gaza, I don't think the answer is another long-term occupation. That's just going to be endless slaughter. Clearly, the answer is not endless bombing and starvation, which is the current process. There's got to be some kind of deal, And I mean, I'm not at this point. I don't think it's my job to prescribe the nature of the deal, But the contours are pretty clear of what a deal could be. It would be releasing the remainder of the hostages, releasing some number of prisoners, some effort to provide Israel with security guarantees. I can't get into those details, but that has to be preferable to what's on the table now. In terms of social media, yes, Human Rights Watch does long-form journalism in a sense, but we're completely involved with social media. I mean, when I left, I think we had 12 million followers between Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I've got 600,000 followers on now X. I use social media all the time, and it is just a supplementary role to journalism. It's another way of reaching people. Now, the danger obviously with social media when you dealt with simply the established media, if somebody wanted to spread disinformation, they would have to contend with journalists and editors, and most of them were conscientious. With social media, you can put forward whatever you want. It can be augmented by bots and AI. So it's easier to spread disinformation. But people often ask me, are we in a post-truth world? And I think the answer is no. And the best evidence of that is the behavior of autocrats. Because, the same people who are mounting massive disinformation campaigns, Putin's or Xi Jinping's agents, are also mounting huge censorship campaigns. They don't trust the disinformation to be enough. They also need to block people from gaining access to the truth. And so, for me, that speaks to the ongoing power of the truth. And I think that's the case because if you want truth, you can find it. You know how to look to reputable sources. You don't just take the first thing that pops up on TikTok. And I think most people are like that. And even though there's a significant segment of the population that just, whatever shows up, they believe, but there's a critical segment, and I think a pretty decisive segment in terms of public opinion, that is in quest of the truth. That's the power of Human Rights Watch. That's the power of, these probably the established newspapers and media outlets that you use. And I think that this is important because truth is the way we hold governments to account.
That's a wonderful last positive note. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone, for coming. The books are outside if you want to get them from Brown Bookstore, and Ken will be happy to sign them. So thank you again for coming.
Thanks a lot.